Thanks everyone so much for being here. We've got a great conversation today with a really prominent Republican voice who's here in Munich with us. Congressman Mike McCaul, Chairman Emeritus of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and we're really looking forward to it. To start off, we're going to talk a lot about China, the Indo-Pacific. Ukraine's dominated the conversations. That'll come up. But we were talking behind the stage for a couple minutes about just this scale and scope of Chinese espionage that the United States, that Europe faces. And I was just wondering if you could open with that and give us your own personal story from your time in working in Justice Department before you came to the Hill, and what type of threat that poses now.
Right. Well, thanks for having me in Politico. I guess my relationship, quote unquote, with China goes back to 1997. I prosecuted the Johnny Chung case. He was taking money from, as we were able to prove later, from the director of Chinese intelligence and China Aerospace, putting it in his Hong Kong bank account and then putting it into the DNC for the Clinton campaign. And I wasn't a Republican or Democrat back then. I was independent. But the fact is, it goes back that far in terms of trying to influence elections, but also the espionage that I saw taking place, particularly when my FBI agent in Los Angeles, who was the lead foreign counterintelligence guy, got indicted for espionage. The whole time I was working with him on this case, and you just can't make this up, he cultivated an asset, an FBI asset, Katrina Leung, who turned out to be a double agent reporting back to Beijing. And so
so it's personal for you?
It's personal because all the information I gave him when the wall was up between criminal and intelligence, thrown over all this stuff, went right back to Beijing to the mothership. And they've had a dossier on me for a long time. But I look at 1997, where they were with espionage, and then I look where they are today, so much more advanced. And they try to influence now in different ways without, campaigns, although they were involved in my last campaign with a disinformation campaign. Again, I was one of 4 members of Congress. Senator Marco Rubio was the other one. And then I got sanctioned when I went to Taiwan, and they're conducting war game exercises around the island. So, and then I saw the Dalai Lama last June, just for the full trifecta, if you will. And of course, he is public number one enemy of the CCP, and that got me, I think, in more trouble.
Yeah, I want to fast forward because Wang Yi was here yesterday from Beijing, and he said that he believes China should be a stakeholder in resolving the Russia-Ukraine conflict, participate in the peace talks here. What do you make of that?
It's like an accomplice to the crime being the judge of the case. I mean, absolutely insane. I mean, they are so complicit with the destruction of Ukraine. I mean, this goes back to the Beijing Olympics. He meets, Chairman Xi meets with, Putin. Putin says, look, I'm going to invade Ukraine. After the fall of Afghanistan, they saw weakness being projected, and Putin decided this is my time to reclaim what is rightly, in his mind, the Russian breadbasket. And he tells Chairman Xi that I'm going to invade. And they form this unholy alliance going back to that date. And Xi says, well, just if you can wait till after the Olympics, and then I will support you. China has refurbished the Russian military to a great extent with technology. So when we see the Russian military, it was decimated. Now it's come back full steam, thanks to Iran as well, which is a partner, thanks to North Korea, who's in Ukraine as well, and then China.
So Trump's talking with Xi. He's clearly talking with Putin. China's role at any point is bound to come up. What's your advice to the U.S. president if China wants to have a role here?
I'd say, I know he wants to build these relationships, and I think it is important for him to talk to our adversaries, but be mindful that they are adversaries. They do not have the interests of the United States, our best interest at heart. and be very careful.
I want to connect these two flashpoints, Ukraine and Taiwan here, because there's a lot of anxiety this weekend about the future of American commitment to NATO, the future of American commitment to Ukraine with this administration. What would a U.S. retreat from Ukraine mean for Taiwan and signals to China?
It's bad news. That's why last year I fought really hard to get the emergency wartime supplemental bill passed, and it was not easy. With the new speaker and Mike Rogers and Mike Turner and I, and it was for Israel, Ukraine, and Indo-Pacific. Had we not passed that, Ukraine would be under Russian domination. I have no question in my mind. What happens in Ukraine has an impact on Taiwan. Why? Because Chairman Xi is watching it very closely, and don't take my word. Take the the presidents of Japan and South Korea. They always tell me what happens in Ukraine will have a direct effect and correlation on an invasion. We know Chairman Xi's talked about the 2027 date. The reason I introduced the CHIPS bill and passed into law under Mike Pompeo's recommendation was to pull supply chain out of Taiwan, given the fact...
And by 2027 date, you mean risk of China invading Taiwan in 2027.
And with the American people, you can say, well, why do we care about an island off the coast of China? But when I explain to them that 90% of the advanced semiconductor chips that are made globally for the world are made in Taiwan, if China does invade Taiwan, they either own it or they break it. Either way, it would have devastating consequences.
And if, as your act is trying to pull some of the supply chain out of Taiwan, does that reduce the U.S. need to defend Taiwan if there's ever a contingency with China?
Well, they do. The Taiwanese see that as a shield, right?
Yeah.
We want to diversify it, and TSMC is in Arizona. This is going to take time to manufacture more of this stuff in the United States. But it's more of a threat to the United States to have all that in one place. Meanwhile, though, I think arming Taiwan's important. I signed off on all the weapons sales, not to get into the defense industrial base issue, but we had a very hard time living up to that commitment. It took 5 years to sell them 20 weapon systems for $20 billion, and we're still not finished, yet. But the more we can arm Taiwan, the more, we have this alliance now with Japan, Philippines, South Korea, and Australia. The AUKUS bill that I passed on the National Defense Authorization Bill is really going to go a long ways towards deterrence in the Pacific. And we know from our briefings that this is what keeps Chairman Xi up at night.
And on those foreign military sales, do you expect that flow of foreign military sales to continue to Taiwan under this administration?
Yeah, they made an exception for Israel. I've urged them to also provide it, FMF to Taiwan. There's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that, because that signals weakness to the CCP.
And what's their reaction when you tell them to do this? Because we haven't seen it yet from them.
Yeah, I think, whether it's USAID and the waivers to the freeze, the whole, I hope when the 85 days are up, they're going to have all this sorted out. But I would urge them, and I saw Senator Rubio last night, that...
Secretary Rubio now.
I'm sorry. So I'm still adjusting.
You got a bit of a promotion.
Yeah. I made the case why that should be part of this.
Did he sound responsive, if not committed?
Yeah, he gets it.
Okay.
He gets China.
Yeah. And on that, I mean, you talked about the link between Taiwan and Ukraine here. There are members of the Trump administration who don't see that link, who argue, no, we need to pull back from Ukraine. This is Europe's problem now because we need to focus on China all the time. So what's your pitch to them on caring about both of these things at the same time? Are they responsive at all? Do some of these people who maybe dug their heels in before they came into office, do they seem more open to this type of conversation?
Well, all you have to do, don't take my word. Talk to the leaders of the nations that are impacted in the Indo-Pacific. Every one of them will tell you this. And I listen to them. And I don't believe this dichotomy about Ukraine and the border. And I mean, we're a powerful country. We can do a lot of great things. I see we got two hot wars going on in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, and we have a hot zone, I call it, in the Indo-Pacific. Where I will agree with them on is that when you look at what keeps you up at night, where would a World War III take place if we're going to look at the geopolitical exercise here? It's most likely the Indo-Pacific, because you're dealing with a great power now in a great power competition that is getting increasingly aggressive. I mean, the last 2 times I was in Taiwan, they were exercising war games around the island. It is a stick in the eye to me, but President Lai, they sanctioned me. After that, they got involved in my campaign. I was in the South China Sea in a military aircraft, and we saw Chinese vessels in Philippine waters with these big, water tanks trying to knock over Philippine vessels. And they would actually relay to us, in Mandarin, you're violating Chinese sovereign territory. You must turn around and go home. They did it like 3 times. We responded.
As you were flying over or on a ship?
Correct. And we said, no, we're in international waters.
So when Wang Yi's on stage here in Munich and says, we want to be a productive partner, we want to talk about Ukraine, we want to stabilize things, what's your reaction to that?
Stop the aggression in the Indo-Pacific, and then we'll talk. I mean, they've gotten very aggressive. Think about the Philippines. We have a security agreement with them. Let's say there's a miscalculation, or a Philippine vessel is sunk, and President Marcos decides, you know what, they sunk my ship, and I'm going to declare war. That almost automatically brings us in the security agreement we have. And so then you're looking at Japan, South Korea, Philippines, United States, Australia, and the United States against Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. That's when I talk about, the threat of a World War III. That's why I do mention the Indo-Pacific, because that could light up those adversaries against each other.
So we need to be present in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, this administration is really gutting some of the soft power tools that the United States has. A full stop on USAID. Chinese officials have already signaled to countries like Nepal, Cambodia, others in Southeast Asia that they're willing to step in because USAID has suddenly, the plug's been pulled. What does it mean for the United States competition with China if the administration is stopping all of these soft power levers that we've relied on in this geopolitical competition?
Well, we need full use of all powers, in our capabilities. I would argue, I was on Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan. By the way, she got thrown off Rubio's plane. She got a crack in the windshield. But
Heard about that.
Whole other story. I actually talked to Secretary Rubio about this last night. Look, there were abuses within USAID. I put holds on the programs to fund drag queen shows and, atheism in Nepal, where you got Tibetan Buddhist monks. I mean, litigation against Catholic countries in Latin America for LGBTQ. They got way off the core mission, but you don't throw the core mission out, the baby out with the bathwater. I think, look, it goes back to the Marshall Plan in this very country. My dad was a bombardier on B-17. He bombed the Nazis, and the Marshall Plan was the best thing we did to avoid another Hitler rising from the ashes. And then the Food for Peace program. Then in 1961, President Kennedy signs the executive order to put USAID into law. Congress authorizes it. Why was it developed back then? To counter the Soviet Union in the Cold War. What do we use with it today? When done right, we use it to counter the CCP primarily, but Russia as well, and to provide stability in fragile nations like the Sahel in Africa from the breeding of terrorists. Lindsey Graham and I introduced the Global Fragility Act, which is DoD, state, and USAID working together as a team to counter our adversaries and terrorism. And then also,
but one of the legs of that three-legged stool has been entirely dismantled here.
I'm okay with it being moved under State Department, especially given the abuses. Then you can have greater supervision by the Secretary of State. It's not a novel concept. Madeleine Albright wanted to do this.
Concept, no, but the implementation of this seems to have really wreaked havoc on this soft power tool.
Well, so that's a great question. So Secretary Rubio has issued waivers for, say, PEPFAR, which is the most successful global health program ever conducted by the United States. It's won a lot of hearts and minds over in Africa, and a lot of humanitarian life-saving medications. We got food rotting in warehouses in Houston, in my home state. You got 500,000 metric tons on ships of food and medicine at sea. That defies common sense. So if you're going to have these waivers and implement them, but I think having it under state would actually bring more oversight and get back to the core mission, and that's using it as diplomatic power for national security purposes.
I guess brass tacks here, DOGE. I mean, are you worried about it going into some of these really important foreign policy, national security apparatuses of the government and coming out and breaking too much more than it fixes it?
Well, you don't want them to tear down programs that work. On the other hand, I mean, they all have security clearances. I'm okay with one of the most successful businessmen in the world who's taken companies, from, like Twitter. He took over that company, made it very successful, the SpaceX. I'm okay with them looking under the hood, seeing how we can modernize through innovation. He's also going to apply an AI model to the federal government, which has never been done before, to look for inefficiencies and really modernize the federal government, which has never been done.
I did want to ask briefly about TikTok, because you've been a leading advocate in the past of banning TikTok, of highlighting the national security threats in the United States. Where does that TikTok ban stand now with the new administration coming in and putting a pause on this plan?
So by executive order, so I passed it actually in the emergency wartime supplemental. And he put a pause on the enforcement. The real goal of Congress is to find a buyer in the United States or our allies who can buy ByteDance, so buy TikTok and the algorithms that they use to manipulate the messaging. If they can achieve that goal in this pause and find a willing buyer to a willing seller, that's the outcome that we were looking for. But Congress, we banned this. Like, we can't use TikTok for a reason.
Yeah.
Because we know how it's kind of like a spy balloon in your phone, with the algorithms, with the data they get. They can see your, the keystrokes. That's why I never use it, but I wouldn't want our children using it.
But from the outside, it looks like Congress passes this law, the new president comes in with the CEO of TikTok at his inauguration, puts a pause on it. It looks like the executive branch really dismissing congressional intent here.
Yeah, well, that's why it's temporary.
Okay.
If it was permanent, we would have constitutional concerns. Just as the, say, USAID, he has authorities under the Foreign Assistance Act to reconsolidate. What he doesn't, I would argue, and it would be a constitutional argument, he doesn't have the authority to terminate departments that have been authorized by Congress. If you're a creature of Congress, it seems to me Congress has the authority, not the executive, to terminate that.
And I did want to ask, just because there are, this administration has some real prominent China hawks who I imagine you align with, Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio,
right.
But also has, Elon Musk, top advisor, billionaire, with tons of vested interest and business interests in China through Tesla. How do you see that playing out in this administration? Are you worried at all that the business ties to China with some people in the president's inner circle might alter in a way that's negative for U.S. national security, U.S. plans to compete with China?
Well, Trump is an interesting manager. He likes to throw a lot of different people in the mix and let them fight each other. And there'll be sort of an ideological discussion there, and then he'll make his decision. I hope he sides with like-minded, like Rubio and Waltz in this particular case. For instance, we're looking at outward-bound capital flows that go into the Chinese military, how we deal with that. The other, when you get back to export controls, back to the Johnny Chung case, why did they do that, right? They did it because they wanted dual-use technology, both satellite and aerospace. And guess what? They got it. So China steals trillions of dollars of intellectual property, but we don't have to sell it to them. And when you talk about, and we haven't gotten into NVIDIA and DeepSeek, but I have a bill called the Enforce Act it would ban the export of military-grade AI technology. Why in the world will we allow U.S. companies to sell military-grade AI technology to China? It makes no sense at all. And then when you look at DeepSeek, this big revelation that China has AI now, we've been worried about this for a long time because what you need to develop AI to open the window are these advanced, very small semiconductor chips. We put a ban on NVIDIA in 2024, but the damage had been done because they sold it to China in 2022. And through that and OpenAI sources, China created DeepSeek.
Should these companies be punished retroactively for laying the groundwork for this?
Well, they wouldn't have been violating export control laws at that time. So that would be a difficult prosecution.
And I mean, do you see Trump as a China hawk? You talked about these people in his mix, both the hawks, the doves, the engagers, the businessmen. Do you think Trump's a China hawk at the end of the day?
His philosophy is very interesting. I think he wants to resolve all these conflicts. He doesn't see these conflicts as being beneficial to the American people. That's why you're seeing, I just got to have a normalization talk with all the leaders in the Middle East. That's why you're seeing, Rubio and Waltz and Wyckoff being dispatched to Saudi to talk to the Ukrainians and the Russians about Ukraine. And I think he thinks that he can work with Chairman Xi to de-escalate the tension. In my judgment, the best way to do that is through deterrence. You have to get in Xi's head that an invasion of Taiwan the risk outweighs the reward. And you can't do that unless you have full deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. If I point out a few specifics, through the AUKUS legislation, and this is basically the United States, UK, and Australia working together, exempted from ITAR, which is the international regulations. Pillar 1, we're already deploying nuclear submarines.
If we can build them fast enough.
It takes too long. It doesn't meet the 2027 timeline. However, we are deploying to the region, to Australia. That troubles Xi. That's the sort of the belly or the beast in the ocean, if you will, the crown jewel. But Pillar 2 involves innovation, AI, quantum, innovation in weapon systems and advanced technologies that are going to be the future of warfare. I talked to Palmer Luckey the other day, the Anduril CEO. They have something called the Ghost Shark in Australia, and it's about 30 feet long. I saw it there. It's a platform, unmanned, AI-driven. It can deliver sea mines, torpedoes. It can surface and deliver drones and missiles. Highly destructive, very small, very stealth. And I said, how many of these would you need to defend the Taiwan Straits? He said, probably 8. 8. How much will these cost? About $10 to $20 million a piece. It sounds like a lot of money, but I know the educated people in this audience know.
Billion here, billion there.
Weapon systems are really expensive.
I've heard.
And so that is think about deploying the Ghost Shark and these nuclear-powered submarines throughout the Indo-Pacific. There's your deterrence right there.
So we talked about deterrence signaling in the Indo-Pacific. We're in Munich. Ukraine's dominating the conversation now. It seems like there's been a lot of mixed messaging with what the Secretary of Defense said and then partially walked back.
Yeah.
J.D. Vance in a speech it didn't really clarify what the Ukraine position is. You've got GOP lawmakers saying we stand with Ukraine, we stand with NATO. A lot of Europeans, their heads are kind of spinning right now. Can you help them cut through all of these mixed messages? Where does the GOP stand on Ukraine and NATO?
Well, I know the president wants an end to the conflict. I would argue the prior administration slow-walked the weapons so badly that we didn't give them the tools they needed to win or push the Russians as far as they could. We tied one hand behind their back. In terms of leverage, I don't think the Ukrainians have the upper hand right now. We met with Zelensky last night. But the president wants peace. But it's got to be a deal where the Ukrainians are at the table in this deal. Now, what's that going to look like? I don't think you negotiate against yourself or either one of these countries. You're going to have to demilitarize these conflict areas and then somehow find a resolution to this. One thing I know that they're working on this, it's really of interest to me, and we should have done this in Afghanistan, is forming an economic alliance with Ukraine when it comes to their rare earth minerals and their natural resources in the ground in Ukraine. This will create, if you think about it, an economic alliance that then would also bring, we would have to protect that asset if we're doing that in Ukraine. So I mentioned this to Zelensky, that would be in his best interest to move forward, with that project. Introduction into NATO is a deal killer. I mean, Putin would never agree to that. But I could see an EU possibility where they're a member of the EU that also has security alliances.
Though Ukrainians would respond to that with NATO is the only thing that matters to us. It's the only thing Putin respects.
But I'm in the world.
Yeah.
Putin would never agree. But what you could do, something Lindsay and I talked about last night, is use NATO as a backstop. So what's going to guarantee that Russia never breaks its word and never invades Ukraine? No. I mean, what's going to assure Ukraine that Russia will never violate this agreement like it did the Budapest agreement when they gave up all their nuclear weapons? Ukraine did. And then Russia invaded and nobody protected them because there were no enforcement mechanisms in that agreement. Whatever is agreed upon will have to have enforcement mechanisms. I can think of no greater enforcement mechanism than a NATO backstop. And this is how it would work. It'd be a trigger tripwire, if you will. If you invade Ukraine again, then NATO is back on the table. That would have a tremendous deterrence.
Did you bring this up with Zelensky, and what was his response?
He likes it.
And you mentioned these talks in Saudi Arabia. Are you hopeful that they can start making ground with the Russians?
Well, so these are two different things. I mean, one, I think on the Ukraine thing, I think a lot of it's going to pivot on the Zelensky signing this contract for the mineral rights in Ukraine and what the Russian posture is. The thing about what J.D. Vance did not say yesterday that I wish he had that I liked was that we're going to use all powers available to get the Russians to play ball. And sanctions, that's the use of military and whatever means necessary, economic and military might to get them to stop the conflict.
Sounds like you're saying J.D. Vance's speech here was kind of a missed opportunity.
Well, I think when I talk to all the bilateral discussions we've had, it's the number one topic because it's the biggest threat to obviously NATO and our European allies. And I think that kind of statement would reassure our European allies that we have their back.
I did want to ask briefly another thing that a lot of German officials are bringing up here. And on the stage is J.D. Vance's meeting with the AfD just days before a critical German election. What's your reaction to that? Do you think that will harm the U.S.-German alliance in any way?
Yeah, I try to stay out of internal politics when I travel, unless they're the only party that stands for democracy and freedom. And so a lot of the countries that are under dictatorships and threats to democracy, we support the democratic thinkers and parties. I wouldn't want to meddle in someone else's politics.
So it sounds like that was a mistake.
I don't know what the goal was there. I'll let him speak to that.
And next steps on Russia-Ukraine negotiations. Where do you see this going with the president and with the Russians?
So my understanding, what they are attempting to do is try to lay the groundwork in Saudi with the Russians and Ukrainians in preparation for an eventual summit with President Trump and Putin. This would be a very monumental achievement if done right. I think what a lot of lawmakers like myself want to see is that Ukraine doesn't get thrown under the bus like they have so many times in their past history.
And do you think Ukrainians will have a seat at the table in that summit? Is that something you're pushing for?
Yes, they need to. And in fact, they do have a seat at the table, as I understand it, at this meeting in Saudi.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Congressman, we are running up on time. I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time today. And if everyone could join me in thanking the Congressman.